Okay, time for another Igor Vasiliev app. This one's called GlitchScaper, and it's basically a sequencer or a set of 6 parallel sequences, in fact. Now these are Euclidean sequences. Now you don't really need to know what that means, but we'll say a bit about it as we go. And we can use this to generate rhythmic sequences rather than melodies. And like I said, we can generate up to 6 different sequences in parallel and mix them together. The sounds can be generated in 2 different ways, either internally from a set of built-in tones, not from audio files incidentally, which you might expect from previous Scaper apps, or we can get the sound by chopping up an input stream with a gate function. And of course we can mix and match between the two, so we can mix some internally generated sounds with some sounds from an external stream. So with this app you can get 2, I think, qualitatively different kinds of sounds, from very rhythmic, kind of fast and glitchy, dirty sounds to much longer ambient sequences that don't really sound rhythmic at all. And of course you can get anything in between. so I think we'll start with a bit of a tour of the user interface, and then we'll focus on trying to make sense of that sequencer, which is really the heart of this app. So this is the main view, and as you can see it's occupied mostly by these 6 identical columns. These represent the 6 generators, we'll call them. So each generator can make its own sound and it has its own sequencer attached to it. Now for the purposes of testing, we're going to mute all of these columns except the first one. So we do that with these buttons at the bottom. And there's an extra column over here at the left. This has global settings for input and output. We're only interested in the output at the moment. And we've got a level control, a simple EQ, a reverb, and I guess a harmonic tweaker at the bottom. Now as with all these rotary controls, we can adjust 2 different parameters. You click once to switch between them. So at the top here we've got the main level, and we can also mix in the input if we're using an input stream as part of the plot. We're not doing that at the moment, so that's kind of a wet and dry mixer, if you like. Okay, back to our first generator column. The first thing to say is this column has 5, as do all the columns, has 5 different pages which we can step through with these little triangles in the header. So if I just click that, I can go left and right, but there's 5 different pages, then we're back to the start. We look at these in turn, but we're going to spend a lot of time on the second one. As you see here, this is where the sequencer is set up and controlled. Back to the first page for now. The only thing we really need for now on this page is the level control. So there's also a pan-in control, which we're not going to make use of, but the level control. And this lets us balance the sounds from each generator independently. The init patch, incidentally, has all of these set to -100. So that's a bit of a gotcha. If you don't realise that, you might find it hard to get any sound out of there at all. Double click any control, by the way, to get a default value. So the rest of the things on this page are for creating sequences or tones randomly as a starting point for your own experiments. We're not going to bother with that for now, so let's move on to the second page. So this is the sequencer page, and it's really the engine room, if you like, of the whole app. Now there is an argument that you can just tinker with this and still get useful sounds, but it really helps if you understand what's going on. So it's going to be worth spending a bit of time pulling this apart. Now this circular thing at the top with the coloured bands isn't an input control, it's an indicator or a gauge, if you like. Now it's kind of hard to see the details, but this has 4 concentric tracks, each of which shows us some detail of what's going on. They look like rings here, but that'll change as we go. For now, this is important. We're just going to ignore the inner 2 tracks, so we're going to focus on the 2 outside tracks only. And just to jump ahead a bit really, as long as these two bottom dials are left at 1, the inner two tracks are irrelevant. We can safely ignore them. Now we will come back to that later, but for now we're interested only in the two outer tracks. The first one, the outermost ring if you like, shows the number of steps in our sequence. It's currently 1, but we can change that with the first dial down here. So if I just click on that, we can change the number of steps, and you can see that outer ring is now broken up into segments. So I've currently selected 8 steps, we'll go with 4 for now. So if I just start the transport, you can see it's stepping through, highlighting each step in green as we go. You should see it's following the BPM setting in AUM. Well, you can't because my head's in the way. But up here, BPM is set to 60. If you see that tap is pulsing in step with the stepping of the sequence. And I've got it set to 60 BPM in AUM, which is 1 beat per second. So a 4-step cycle takes 4 seconds to complete. Now we can slow the sequence down by stretching the length of each step to be more than 1 beat. That's the purpose of this second parameter on the top dial. So if I set it to 2, for example, the sequence takes twice as long to cycle. If you watch it step through and also watch the BPM indicator again, you can see that that matches up. 1, 2, and then it advances 1, 2, advances 1, 2. Now it's important to say that's the only significance of that beat parameter, to slow the sequence down or speed it back up. I'm just going to set it back to 1. Okay, so far we haven't got any sound, so let's have a look at that. Let me just set the number of steps to 8. Now if this was a regular step sequencer, we'd somehow select each step to be on or off. That's not how this works. This is where the Euclidean part comes in. We tell it how many of the steps we want to make noise, and the sequencer algorithm decides which steps to turn on. And we do that with the second dial, which is labelled pulse, this one here. Igor calls these pulses, but I'm going to call them noisy steps, or perhaps noise making steps. So if you watch as I'm tweaking this control, you'll see that something else is changing on the gauge at the top of the column. And what's actually happening is the second track is highlighting the noisy or the noise making steps. So if you count the number of those orange segments in the second track, you'll see it's the same number that we've selected on that dial down here. So it's currently 3, 4, 5, 6, and we can go all the way up to 8, all the way down to 1. And what's interesting, if I select 2 or 3, let's say 3, those noise making steps are distributed evenly around, or as evenly as is possible to do given the constraints of integer arithmetic, around the steps of the sequence. And that's the Euclidean algorithm. So you can see if we have an 8-step sequence with 3 noise making steps, it's not perfectly even. In fact, this would be a good time to hear this. I've got it muted at the moment, so let me just unmute. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the BPM temporarily to something much higher, and then it should be obvious. And unmute. So you can see that's irregular because 3 doesn't divide into 8, very obviously. If we just do another example, let's make a 16-step sequence and we'll give it 8 noise making steps. Now 8 goes into 16 nice and regularly, so we get a nice regular pulse like that. So if we change that into something that doesn't divide easily into 16, you'll see we get some irregularity, but it's a regular irregularity, so to speak. And this is one of the things that begins to make our rhythms interesting. Now the keen observer might have noticed that we have another parameter on that second dial. It's called shift. And you can see that if I tweak that, well, can you see? We lower the number of pulses. Let me go down to 3. So if I tweak the shift, you see that it shifts the position of those noisy steps around the dial. So that just gives us a bit of extra control over the precise positioning of those noisy steps. Now you probably noticed this red circle, by the way, that seems to flash on every time we pass through one of the noise making steps. So for now we'll just leave it as simple as that. The red thing indicator comes on when there's noise or sound playing. But this being an Igor app, I do have to reach for the obligatory stock phrase. It's not that simple, but we'll come back to the sequencer later. But now that we've got it to make some sounds, we're going to take a break and have a look at how to make those sounds a little bit more interesting. So let's head back to the top of our generator column and flip to the next page. This is where we control where the sound comes from. This is the tone page. The first thing to note is that down here we've got 2 clickable buttons. The one we're interested in for now is the one that says tone. That tells us that we're hearing an internally generated sound, which is one of 12 possible bass tones. I don't think you can select these manually, but when you generate a tone randomly from that first page, one of the 12 is selected. There's just a default, the tone we're hearing at the moment is a default tone. If we let this run, just unmute. Just need to set my BPM back to something a little bit more rational. We'll go back to 60. So if I let that run and I tweak the button that currently says tone, we get noise as the next option, and then we get input. So that's taking an input stream.
He had written himself.
And back to tone. That input stream is just a file played in AUM. I'll just show you, we've got the AUM file player here with some speech. For now we're going to stick with that boring tone. Now we can make it less boring by tweaking this dial at the top. This allows us to set a gate with an envelope on the sound. Now I've got it set here to a square wave that lasts for the entire length of the step. But if we tweak that, we should hear how the sound changes. And then with the other dial, we're changing the kind of the balance of that envelope, if you like. I'm just going to set up the second generator to be the same as the first, and I'll show you why in a second. So we want 1 step, 4 beats, 2 pulses. We want the same envelope shape. So if I let that run, you can see that they're varying in step. But if I flip this one back to the home page, you should now see what that little green triangle is showing. It's actually following the gate envelope that we set on the tone page. And just something else to point out about that gate envelope, you see it's just an attack release envelope, so its length is always the length of the step. If we make the steps longer, let's say by setting the number of beats per step to 2 instead of, oops, on this guy as well. Put that back to the home page and unmute it. So now the sound is longer and the shape of the envelope is more noticeable. You can hear the difference, but you can also see it over here. Okay, back to the tone page. If we skip to the third dial for now, this lets us mess with the frequency of the tone. If we set these values back to default by double clicking, we get the raw tone. Which is considerably lower, but we can tweak the octave and the frequency by changing this dial. So that's the octave, and then the other parameter is the frequency. Now you might have noticed that little green triangle on the frequency slider, and that brings us to that second envelope control up here. It doesn't seem to be doing anything right now, but if we tweak the modify slider down here, let it, you can see it controls that frequency and octave modification. What else? Finally, the second parameter of that bottom dial changes the waveform of the tone. And if we're using a noise generator instead of a tone, it changes the type of noise. And if we're using an input stream, it sets the length. In fact, let's just try that. It sets the length of the rolling input buffer in seconds. Now you don't really need a tutorial for the next two pages. These are just about applying effects to the sounds. If you look at the fourth page, so we've got glitch effect, comb filter, we've got a high pass, low pass, band pass filter. We've got an envelope for the application of each of those. Let's just whiz through and see what these sound like. Go with some glitching. So the glitch effects are just various bit crushing and address mangling effects that will be very familiar if you have any of the other Scaper apps. Oh, what else? The comb filters just... what they are. I won't bother demonstrating the high pass and low pass filters, you know what they sound like. Then on page 5 we've got a delay, reverb, chorus, phaser, but I'm not going to go through these. And then we're back to the main page. Right, back to the sequencer page. You knew this was coming. Let's set up this simple example again. To recap, we want a 4-step sequence with 2 noisy steps, which is what we've got here. In fact, let's reduce that to 1 noisy step. So if I let that run, mute it for now, you see we've got that one highlighted orange segment on the second row. That's when the noise plays. We get that red flash for the duration of that step. So now I'll direct your attention to the bottom 2 dials. Now these do almost exactly the same as the top 2 dials. But instead of subdividing the sequence, they subdivide the noise making steps of the sequence. Now the best way to show this is to make a really long sequence by setting this over parameter to something, let's set it to 16. So now you can see that that third ring in the indicator at the top has become segmented. Well, you can see it if you've got very good eyesight. And then each time the main sequence hits a noisy step, you can see a second indicator zipping around that ring. Now we can slow that down a little bit by stretching our sequence to 2 beats per step. So it makes a little bit more time for us to see that indicator traversing the the ring. Now then, you should be able to see that on the fourth track, that's the inner ring, you can see a little orange segment. Now, just like a segment on the second ring shows a noise making step in the sequence, a segment on the fourth ring shows a noise making sub-step. So we'll only hear any sound for that little part of the step. Let's just unmute it and hear what we hear. And if we go to the bottom dial, we can tell it how many noisy sub-steps we want instead of the one that we've got here. Now this should be quite familiar. In fact, what's happening here is we're creating a second Euclidean sequence that gives structure to the noise making step itself. And just to point out something that may not be obvious, those gate and frequency envelopes on the tone page now get triggered every sub-step of that noise making step, rather than just once for the whole length of that step. So you should begin to see that we can create very long and very intricate sequences with very complex and rich structure. I'll leave it for you to research what the mode and shift secondary parameters on these two dials do. They're basically just, again, adding more finesse to the positioning of those sub-steps by shifting them clockwise and anti-clockwise in various automated ways. But you can figure that out by tweaking and reading the help. So I don't know if that's a clear enough explanation of the sequencer, but maybe it's enough to get you started. So it might be worth just having a quick look at these randomized functions on the first page of the generator. If we let's set up the sequence manually. So we give it 4 steps and we'll give it 2 noise making steps. If we just play that, so that's the standard tone and untweaked by the frequency parameters. But if we go back to that front page, I'll just mute that a second, we've got 2 randomize options. We can randomize the sequence by pressing make sequence. We're not going to do that, we just set that up. We can do randomize the tone by set the parameters down here and then just click make tone. We'll just leave the parameters as they are for now and click make tone and see what we get. We just try, so it's doing the same sequence, different tone. If we just make tone again, that one's interesting. If I just mute that, what it seems to be doing, we'll just check this out. It's created a tone, but it's randomized some of the other parameters as well, because we're hearing things like delay and so on. If we go into the tone page, we'll see we can see it's set the gate envelope parameters, it's set a frequency envelope there, it's tweaked the frequency range, both parameters, and it's set the waveform to something other than default. And that's what it sounds like. But if we go further and look at the glitch, it's put a comb filter on there, it's got a bandpass filter. These two buttons just change they give us some control but not complete control over the settings for the bandpass filter and the other types of filter. Let's put an envelope on. Well, it doesn't have it's randomised the glitch envelope, but there's no glitch effect set on. But we've got a comb filter, bandpass filter. What else? We've got some delay and some reverb. This reverb, by the way, is it's particular to this generator, and it can be different to the reverbs and indeed the delay and all the other parameters. They can be set on a per generator basis. And then over here at the left there is a global, I don't think it's a global delay, but it's a global reverb. So anyway, those per generator settings have been randomized, and we've also got phasing effect put on as well. So I think those are the only things that we get. So we'll just try a couple more of those. Make tone again. So you see, you can use that as the starting point for your own experiments, and then you can go in, for example, and add glitching to that. That's quite a subtle glitch. I mean, I like that already. Alright, so if we keep that tone, I'm going to mute for a second and go back to the main page again. The other thing we can do is we can randomize the sequence. Now this is going to be much more chaotic, I would warrant. So our current sequence is 2 steps, 2 noise making steps, sorry, 4 steps in the sequence, 2 of them are noise making steps, and there are no sub-step sequences set. So if we go and randomize that, we just unmute it first, right, click make sequence, and then go and look at what we got. So we got a 8-step sequence with 8 beats per step, so it's a very slow sequence. We've got 5 noise making pulses over the length of the sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What else? We've got the, if I just mute that for now, if we look at the bottom 2 dials, we've got the, I don't know why that parameter is called over. It's very spuriously named. I could probably think of a better name for that. Sub-steps might be a candidate name. But we've got 4 sub-steps to each noise making step. And I don't know what those, that's a automatic shift tweaking mode to shift those steps around, those sub-steps around, so I won't bother looking at that. And then 2 of those 4 sub-steps are going to generate sound. So there you go, I won't say too much more about that. Hopefully this will at least incline you somewhat in the direction of being able to understand this sequencing mayhem. And of course we've only been working on one generator. Once you've got 6 of them fired up in a row, the potential for richness is vast, and probably the potential for mess and noise is also fairly vast. To round off, let's maybe take a quick look at using an input stream instead of the built-in tones. First thing we're going to do is go to the tone page. We're going to change it from tone to input. We'll start with the gate as a square wave, again for the length of the step, just to make it simple. The other thing we have to do is, well, we don't have to do anything actually. If we could just let it go back to our sequence, we'll make it a 4-step sequence again. We'll make it with 2 noise making steps, just so we're on familiar territory. You notice we've got a little green triangle on there that we don't have on the other generators at the top left there. That means we're processing an input stream rather than internally generated tones. And just to show you that in my AUM setup, I've got a file player as our input stream. So let's just run that and see what happens. Unmute. And that input stream is speech. It sounds a bit wrong at the moment, and that's because by default on the tone page, if we go to the frequency and range setting, we're at 0.25 normal speed. That means this is no longer an octave control. Well, is it an octave control? I'm not sure how this relates to octaves. I think 1.0 is normal speed. 2 is probably an octave higher. I don't know, something like that. So if we play it now, yeah.
More lamp.
This is the input buffer length. So if we change that to, I don't know, 4 seconds.
And then Mr. Brock.
Okay. Tweak the envelope, the gate envelope. Give it a different shape.
Appearance of it.
So you can hear that.
Never been known.
Another thing we can do actually is if we go to the, just mute that, we go to this output tab at the left hand side, output column at the left hand side of the screen. That's actually got 2 pages. We've got input and output. We haven't looked at input yet. Now it's important to know how the input stream gets chopped up. If we look back at the main page, we'll see that that green flash at the top left is actually flickering between green and red. That when it's red, that means that input is being taken from the input stream into the buffer. And you might wonder why it's switching on and off. Well, that's over here. There's another gate function which we can set to off, which means that the input is constantly being recorded. Let's see how that sounds.
Since it is not trickery as an objection,
it basically means that the input stream is continuous, but it's only played when we hit these noise making steps. If I change the number of noise making steps up to 4, we should just get continuous playback of that input, I would predict.
For October 20th, 1871, boasts of having turned a recent convert to the zetetic philosophy by telling him that his arguments were all very good.
So it is indeed doing that, but of course it's gating each of the noise making steps with this gate here. If I just go and switch that back to a square wave, we should hear uninterrupted.
Of the objector, the objection is a counterfeit, a fraud, no valid objection at all.
So that's an ungated input stream. If we click the gating to, if I just let that run,
the zetectic philosophy of parallax is
and
destined to live. This is a proof that the Earth is not a globe.
if we
It
click
is
the
well known
gating
that the
to
law regulating
low,
the apparent decrease in the size of objects as we leave them in the distance or as they leave us
we've got
is
a bit
very
of a
different
flicker.
with luminous bodies,
If we
or
set
as they
it
leave
to
from what it is in the case of those from which are non-luminous, Sail past the light of a small lamp in a rope.
So what's happening there is we're getting a gate on, I guess, the level of the input, and so when the level drops below a certain threshold, the recording cuts off. If we set it to high, we should get a much emphasized gate effect.
On the therefore look much large.
So that is what I think is leading to that stutter effect. The buffer between some steps is not being refilled, and so we get repetition of the previous sound because we've got the gating on high. We've also, after the gating step, there's an automatic level control. If I turn that off, what happens? It's fairly quiet. If I turn it on, let's put that on medium.
He saw indeed that in his faith in parallax, he had written himself down an ass. He had written himself, well then.
So that's kind of interesting. We could go through and try some of the other. In fact, let's turn that pulses back down to 2.
Parallax live.
We'll go back to the gate envelope. Change that to. Let's change it to just. Put some glitching on. It's not such a. Turn the glitching off. That's too
and then he
freaky.
It goes.
In fact, if we go to the tone and we got an envelope on the tone, we'll do that. And dial it up a bit. So that envelope is on the frequency of the tone.
Yes.
Okay. So. So there you go. I'm not going to persist with that. That's just tinkering with. It's quite helpful to use an input stream that's well, something like speech that's coherent, and you can. It's more obvious what's happening. If you're just exploring this. I think what's really interesting, I found really interesting, is to just load up some of these presets. There aren't that many. Well, there's quite a lot of these beats which I don't like. I'm not interested in these kind of dance beats. That's what they're kind of like. But these longer form, sort of weird ambient ones. That's much more what I'm interested in. Am I muted or unmuted there? Unmuted now. Oh, that's because they're all muted, isn't it? It's just really interesting to load one of these in and then pull it apart and just see what, how the thing is constructed. To set one of these things up from scratch, manually constructing all the sequences, it's quite a lengthy and quite a creative endeavour. So there it is, GlitchScaper from Igor. I'm certainly going to do a lot more exploration with this, try and make some of these longer form ambient kind of sequences for myself. And if I come up with anything interesting, maybe I'll do another video.